Alright guys, so let's talk about the fate of US industries because things are not just looking bleak, it's downright disastrous. It's like every time I take a look at Trump's strategy, it makes less and less sense every single day. He is isolating the entire economy and making it even harder for his original plan to succeed. Now, doesn't he want the US manufacturing to soar? Last time I checked, the plan was to export everything to the world, right? And for no reason at all, Trump has imposed a crazy 50% tariff on copper imports that will take effect August the 1st. It's just a few weeks away. And because of that, US futures have flown up to 28% over the LME, which is the world's hub for metal trading. Now, copper in the US is much more expensive, and there could be more room for the price to run up. I think we need to sit back and understand the importance of copper in any industry, especially one where Trump wants to build back US manufacturing capabilities. You need copper in chips, shipbuilding, cars, industrial wiring, construction, and the list virtually goes on. Besides, iron is the core metal necessary to build modern civilization, and Trump wants to jack prices to the moon, and this is just so crazy. More than 40% of copper used in the US is imported. Trump is going to strangle many major imports coming to the country. And it's true that there are big deposits of copper in the US, but trying to dig that out of the ground will be very expensive. Not forgetting the materials needed to extract the copper themselves will be subjected to tariffs. We aren't even factoring in the permits, the labor costs, and the high cost of energy needed to operate the mines. And the facts laid out by ING Bank really tells us Trump is not going to revive the US copper industry. There are just too many hurdles beyond the existing tariffs. Over the last decade, US copper production has seen a 20% decline, and in global terms, they only produce 5% of the world's supply, so they can't really affect prices. Other suppliers can easily flood the market with copper and crush US margins pretty easily. Meanwhile, it can take up to 29 years to build a new mine, and that's a wrap. Did the previous tariffs work to boost US commodity production? Well, the evidence shows that this just isn't the case. Despite the US metal tariffs in 2017, steel production was down by 1% lower last year. And for aluminum, the industry produces almost 10% less. So we can confidently sit back and say US producers will not be able to catch up. And on the flip side, that also means US input costs will be flying to the moon. So imagine if you're a Japanese company or a German firm looking to shift your production to the US. Does it even make sense to attempt the impossible? Now, it's guaranteed that your input costs will fly to the moon, and this introduces a double whammy not just to domestic US customers. Exports from the US are fated to plunge if Trump doesn't hit the U turn soon. Every manufacturer thinking of shifting to the US needs to understand this. In May 2025, exports of goods decreased by 4% to $279 billion. The world began buying less of US industrial supplies, materials, and capital goods. Now, is some of it because of hatred against the tariff war? I'm sure there's definitely a good percentage here. But the big problem is higher prices. Exports coming out of the US are no longer competitive. Now imagine the state of exports when copper prices goes up by 50%. If you build cars or chips in the US, you can kiss goodbye to any idea of selling your product overseas. It will be used to satisfy domestic US demand, and relying on just one customer is dangerous business indeed. Now, alarm bells are ringing when it comes to consumer sentiment. Trump has managed to crush it back down to near the 2022 lows, and this is 70% of the US economy deciding not to spend money or to at least scale back. And here's the ominous part of this reading. Over the 79 years of the survey, a fall this fast has almost always predicted a recession. And remember that Q1 GDP is negative. We might see a partial jump in consumption in July. People might rush out to buy more houseware or even electronics. But come August, US supply chains won't be able to provide for this shortfall, which means US importers will pay the 50% tariff to the US government. And we know how that story ends. The cost will trickle down to the consumer, you and me. They will have to pass the cost down. There's no other alternative. Or they can start firing workers, which will tank the economy even faster. Now, behind door A is a staircase to hell. Behind door B is a steep drop down the cliff. Same destination, economic hell. So, which countries will be affected by the copper tariffs? Now, Chile, Canada, Mexico, and Peru will see their exports to the US fall. Now, for Chile, this is quite devastating to their copper industry. The US alone accounts for 11% of their total copper exports. Now, some will still get sold into the US, importers will absorb the tariff. And don't forget that copper is a commodity, and in commodity trading, the margins are razor thin, sometimes in the low single digits, and I'm not kidding here. Giving discounts is just not possible, which means Chile needs to divert their supply elsewhere and they gotta do it very quickly. And here's where things get funny. Now, which country do you think Chile and other copper exporters sell the majority of their stuff to? Now, it's not the US, and it's not to their neighbors. Europe also isn't a big consumer of copper thanks to their energy crisis. Now, you guessed it, it's China, Trump's biggest economic rival. Mexico and Chile export the majority of their copper to China. The Chilean foreign minister says that his exports will keep finding new markets. But let's be realistic here. There's no way to find new mystery buyers in just a few weeks. It's quite impossible, so China now holds all the cards. Global exporters will have to sell into Chinese markets, and when supply goes up, prices comes crashing down, which makes Chinese manufacturing even cheaper. Now, despite the trade war, Chinese exports to the world have soared, especially when it comes to Asian countries. Trade with Southeast Asia alone has more than hit $50 billion. Now, Trump's going to hit the entire region more or less with tariffs of at least 20%, which will just trigger them to huddle closer with China to get cheaper inputs. Now, when we throw on top the copper tariffs, China benefiting means their trading partners also stand to gain, and it's just one big circular trade. China helps manufacture the components, the products get assembled elsewhere, and then get shipped to the US at a much higher price. And that's just on the manufacturing side. Within the US itself is a silent struggle between the Federal Reserve and Trump, which we must discuss. The deal is very simple here. Now, Trump wants power to slash interest rates to save the US economy, and if it doesn't, power will need to go. Doesn't get any simpler than that.
I think he's doing a terrible job. I think we should be, no, I think we should be 3 points lower interest rate. He's costing our country a lot of money. We should be number one, and we're not. And that's because of Jerome Powell. In terms of interest, we are number one in the world.
But here comes the rub. There will be big consequences if Trump decides to do that. According to Deutsche Bank, there's still a good risk of Jerome Powell getting kicked out of his position. And the market still isn't pricing in this risk. Trump is just too volatile. He might just transplant Besson from the Treasury all the way to the Fed. Then, yes, we will get rates at 1%, no doubt about it. And if Trump kicks Powell out, the next 24 hours could be a complete disaster for the US financial system and by extension, the entire economy. The trade-weighted dollar could drop by at least 3 to 4%, which means the actual dollar strength could plunge more than 5%. Foreign investors will not be happy. Meanwhile, the fixed income sell-off could hit 40 basis points, and it makes sense here. Why would you buy US bonds when the underlying asset itself, which is the dollar, is rapidly losing value? Now, Trump just doesn't understand how disastrous hijacking the Federal Reserve will be. It won't just hammer down US assets, you risk capital flows out of the American markets. And every time the US makes a mistake, it allows China to get stronger. Both economies are joined at the hip, and it used to be both sides growing together. China gets richer, the US gets richer as well, and vice versa, but not anymore. Someone's loss is another person's gain, and this is the new paradigm we are in. It's zero-sum thinking, I know, but it's how this brave new world now operates. I don't like it, but this is objective reality. An advisor to the PBOC is hinting that it's time to unleash the stimulus money. Unleash $209 billion or 1.5 trillion yuan to boost domestic consumer spending. Not only that, the plan is to manage the RMB better, and that means allowing the currency to weaken even further if necessary to make Chinese exports more competitive. Now, it's not a guarantee that China will make this happen, and I think the current tariff level is quite manageable for Chinese exporters. they can still make some money and sell elsewhere if needed. But if Beijing really makes it happen, oh boy, it will be nightmare mode for Trump's reshoring. His mistakes will compound if China decides to strike back by simply building up their own domestic market. Meanwhile, let's talk a bit about the big US surplus last month. Now, since Trump started his tariff war, it makes sense that the tax revenue will increase, doesn't it? If you slap a 20 or 30% tariff on any good, it makes sense that taxes will come in. But does it really mean the US economy is in the clear and Trump has won his trade war? Well, not really. In June, the Treasury recorded an impressive $27 billion in custom duties. And that's a consistent increase since April when the chaos started. And because of this, the surplus in June hit $27 billion. That's much more than the $71 billion deficit in June last year. So you could argue that it is night and day. And on the surface level, it looks like the US government now has a ton of money to spend. Maybe Trump could fund his $3.4 trillion tax bill after all and just use the revenue from customs. But let me bring you back to reality. Who pays for the tariffs? It's either the customer who buys the product or the importer that brings in the product. And it's really important to see the tax revenue increase as a transfer of money. It's going from the private sector to the public sector. And how is Trump spending that money? Well, the tax bill is giving more money to the rich than the economy in general. So let that fact just sink in. And most of the time, people that rich don't really go back to consume more stuff or start new companies. They simply go around and buy up more existing assets. So the brunt of the pain will hammer companies big and small. They will be the ones that absorb the tariffs and squeeze their bottom line like never before. And in the first half of 2025, over 370 large US companies went bankrupt. That's an incredible amount that's even more than the disaster in the 2020 lockdowns. And just look at the categories that have gone under. Industrial and consumer discretionary have led the bankruptcy filings, followed by healthcare. Now, with the new spree of tariffs and China rising, we can expect US companies to face a double whammy: lower margins and greater competition in the export market. So, the corporate tariffs are just going to crush US industrials further. And will the bankruptcies continue? Most definitely. Going forward, we still have Europe and Mexico facing a 30% tariff. And these are big trading partners with the US, which will drive costs higher as a consequence. We can also foresee EU customers, consumers not buying US products as well. So it's actually a triple blow coming for US companies. And unless a miracle happens at this point, it's best to brace for impact. But let me know what you think. Will Trump U-turn the corporate tariffs? And will China take advantage of US weakness? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.